Welcome to the SYW Showcase. This time we're looking at the Prussian army of the 7 Years' War. While the politics behind it were many and varied, the 7 Years' War in Europe began in 1756 with Frederick the Great of Prussia overrunning and annexing Saxony. France and Austria allied to oppose this move, while Britain supported Prussia. The Holy Roman Empire also mobilised to join the anti-Prussian alliance. The end result was a confusing mass of alliances where most of the smaller German states opposed Prussia, while a minority actually allied with Frederick. With the Central European states gearing up for war, Sweden joined in the fun, hoping to regain Pomerania from Prussia, and while Spain took the opportunity to invade Portugal. Russia weighed in, initially joining the anti-Prussian alliance, but completely switched its position upon the accession of Tsar Peter III in 1762, who was a massive admirer of Frederick. The war had begun disastrously for Prussia, but with a great deal of good luck and some very successful, excellent strategy, Frederick managed to hold on to retain the status quo ante bellum. He had solidified his country's position as one of the newer European great powers, albeit at a huge cost of soldiers' lives on both sides of the alliance. Now, there was a separate and ultimately more decisive part of the 7 Years' War, fought in the wilds of North America between Britain and France, but that will be covered in a future showcase. The 7 Years' War offers the wargame a mix of fascinating characters and colourful armies. Some of the German states' forces are small enough to model in their entirety, but still remain large enough to field by themselves on a wargames table. It is also the classic period for imaginations, so beloved of the early pioneers of modern wargaming, such as Charles Grant. The Bacchus 7 Years' War range covers all of the major and minor nationalities of the period. We are today showcasing the army of Prussia, but we have an equally broad coverage of Austrian, British, French and Russian armies, both in Europe and North America. SPR-1, Prussian Line Infantry. The army that Frederick used to such great effect in the early phases of the war was inherited from his father, Frederick William I. The infantry were renowned for their discipline and their robotic-like drill, which enabled them to move, manoeuvre and reload at a pace that confounded their opponents. However, constant campaigning took its toll on the regiments, and their capabilities declined as the war continued, and recruits and replacements could not be trained quickly enough to the required standard. The battalion shown here is from Infantry Regiment 14, von Lewald. SPR-2, Prussian Grenadiers. The Grenadiers were the elite troops of the regiment. They were supposedly the tallest and bravest, although whether the former of the two attributes automatically led to the latter is open to doubt. Their main distinguishing feature was their tall mitre headdress. Now, in battle, the Grenadier companies were detached from their parent body and paired with the Grenadiers from another regiment. These combined units were stationed on the ends of the infantry lines to protect and shore up the vulnerable flanks. Such formations did not carry any colours. This unit consists of Grenadiers drawn from the Infantry Regiment No. 18, Prince von Preußen. SPR-3, Prussian Fusiliers. Fusiliers were formed from the regiments raised after the conquest of Silesia. It was said that the men forming these units did not have the large build of the troops traditionally forming Prussian infantry regiments, and they were given cut-down mitre caps to make them appear taller. Tactical use was exactly the same as any other line infantry regiment. The battalion on the turntable is IR-39, Jung Braunschweig. SPR4, Prussian cuirassiers. Now, in contrast to the magnificent infantry regiments which Frederick inherited from his father, the mounted arm was lacking in training, speed, quality and tactics. Frederick described them as, quote, bad. Now, given his well-known way with words, this short and simple description speaks volumes about the low opinion that he had of his cavalry at that time. He set about reforming this arm of service. The results were remarkable, and the cuirassiers, as the cutting edge of the cavalry, typified this massive improvement. Cuirassiers were recruited from large men and mounted on big horses. They were equipped with back and breastplates and a long straight sword. They were most definitely shock troops. This unit is KR1 von Buddenbrock. SPR6, Prussian Hussars. Hussars were initially irregular light cavalry originating from Central Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. The title and distinctive dress of these horsemen was subsequently widely adopted by light cavalry regiments in European armies during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. All hussars wore elaborate uniforms decorated with braid, and they developed a romanticised image of being dashing and adventurous. In fact, they were often used on the Petite Guerre, the war of raiding against lines and effectively guerrilla warfare. Not as romantic as it sounds. However, Frederick recognised the value of hussars as light cavalry and greatly expanded the number of units from an initial 2 regiments to a total of 9. SPR8, Jägerkorps zu Fuß. Initially consisting of 2 100-strong companies, the Jäger were regular light infantry as opposed to those units forming part of the irregular Freikorps. They took part in the Battle of Leuthen, where they performed well enough to be expanded to full battalion size of 800 men. Unfortunately, the new unit was attacked while in the open by Cossacks while taking part in the Battle of Charlottenburg in 1760. The unit was effectively wiped out at that stage. 1 year later, the unit was reformed but only at 4 companies' strength, and they served in that formation until the end of the war. The Jaeger foreshadowed the use of disciplined light infantry in drab uniforms that was to become the norm in the following century. SYG, 7 Years' War Generals. There was a great deal of similarity in terms of cut and style between the uniforms of the generals of the various armies of the period. Here you can see a group of our generic generals painted as senior officers of the Prussian army. Frederick was blessed with a number of excellent generals, both in the infantry and especially the cavalry, where Generals von Seydlitz and Zieten moulded their regiment into a formidable strike force. Frederick's subordinates were vital in putting his plans and tactics into operation. As is usual for any Wargames period, there are many rule sets to choose from. For this video, I will be looking at just 3 sets, concentrating on those whose mechanics suit the use of small-scale figures. The first set is our very own Polymos Ruse de Guerre. This is the latest in our series of rules and benefits from developing and refining the system over the years. Although the main thrust of the set covers the war in the Americas, notably the French and Indian War and the AWI, they have actually proved very adaptable and can be used for the European conflict with little or no alterations or upgrades. As with all the Polymos rule sets, Ruse de Guerre has been designed with 6mm figures as a focus of the game, rather than as an add-on to a set designed for larger scale figures. Bacchus offers a range of army packs with units designed for Polymos-sized bases. They offer a relatively cheap and quick way to start armies for this fascinating period of history, and as with all of our ranges, we support them with a range of detailed and well-researched flag sheets, which really work to bring out the best from your finished units. All of which brings us on to Warlord Games' Black Powder rules. Amazingly enough, given that Warlord started out as focused purely on 28mm figures, all of their rule sets work very well indeed with 6mm figures, as their mechanics work on an area style basing rather than single figure casualty removal. Black Powder have proved to be a very popular option for 6mm gamers gaming across the 18th and 19th centuries. And finally, we have Twilight of the Soldier King. As with Polymorphs, this is one of a series of rules sharing a core set of mechanics with period variations. Once again, they work on the principle that one base represents a battalion, and the mechanics work very well for large-scale battles. This is a highly recommended set of rules. Now, the very idea of painting figures standing just 6mm high can trigger a wide range of pretty negative emotions from those who have never actually tried to paint these little warriors. Expressions of fear, disbelief and exasperation are all quite commonplace. You get declarations of potential damage done to eyesight, a major strain on the limits of patience, and the sheer impossibility of ever actually being able to paint the wee chaps. Well, the good news is it's actually dead easy to paint these 6mm figures. In fact, I would go far as saying that they're actually easier to paint than those big 28mm monstrosities that people seem so caught up in at the moment. Let me detain you for a few moments and take you step by metaphorical step through the process of producing a battalion of smartly turned out Prussian infantry from the army of Frederick the Great. We'll start with blue. Working from a black undercoat and using the trusty size 1 brush, it's a case of working down the line, dabbing the paint on the arms and the back of the uniform coats. You use surprisingly little paint here, despite the original wearing a blue coat, as equipment and strapping covers a lot of the surface. Time for red. Add a splash of colour. Forget massively complex cuff designs, button colours and piping. A blob or line on each wrist with Ballyho base red, and that's done. Pick out the turnbacks where they're obvious, and a dot for the red cravat. Job completed. Let's move on. White. Now, using white paint, starting with the front of the figures, you dot and triangle the small clothes, that's the waistcoat to the uninitiated, where they form a triangle underneath the cross straps, the breeches between the bottom of the coat and the knee, and finally the cross straps themselves. Now, not every line, blob or triangle you make here will be perfect. In fact, many of mine are far from that. However, if you make a mistake, let it go. Move on and forget it. It will not show in the finished article. Trust me on this. Perfection is not required. Brown. Now, you'll find a nice little triangle of hair on the back of the figure to pick out. And using the same colour, the musket stocks are painted where they appear below the left hand at the front and above the shoulder at the rear. And now we arrive at painting flesh. Now, this is either dead easy or really, really difficult, depending on your aptitude and attitude, really. In 6mm, it is very simple. First of all, just put blobs of colour on the hands. Don't even think about trying to do fingers. Now, for the face, you've got a couple of options. A simple blob of flesh will work very nicely. But as you can see in this case, I've just taken it a little bit further, and that you put a stripe of flesh on the nose, and then a little blob of flesh either side of the nose to highlight the cheeks, and if you're feeling up to it, a third blob on the chin. It doesn't look like much when viewed at this size, but step back and it makes your unit really pop, and it is not difficult to do. Now, the next coat is traditionally silver. That's for metallic things like musket barrels and bayonets. In fact, I've now moved to using a light grey, and I've actually found it works quite well. But it's up to choice. You can see the end results on this picture. And finally, we come back to white again. Now, one of my personal aims is never to use the same colour twice, but in this case I've done it because we come to a very important point in the job. We need to add the hat lace. And this is probably the fiddliest and most delicate bit of the whole process. And I cheat, I admit it. A few years ago I wandered into a craft shop and made a brilliant discovery. It was a pen that used white paint but had an ultrafine point. But I've never looked back. It makes painting hat lace a pleasure. If you aren't lucky enough to find one of these magnificent pieces of kit, then the trusty size 0 brush will still make short work of things, but you'll need just a little bit more care and time. And with the lacing gun, dotting the pom-poms on the top and side of the hats, and you're done. And there you have it. Just 7 steps and you have got your painted Prussians. Now individually, they will still look a little rough. It goes without saying that the figures that you've just been looking at on this painting demo are magnified. In fact, on my screen they measure 90mm tall. That is a multiplication factor of 15. On the same scale, a 28mm figure would stand at 42 centimetres tall, and I think even the greatest Golden Demon winner would look a little crude when you magnify all the size of the imperfections to that level. Now what you have to understand is that when viewed at actual size and put together as a unit, now that's when the magic happens. I do hope that you've enjoyed this short introduction to our 7 Years' War Rangers. I'll leave you with a couple of pictures of the momentous Battle of Backersdorf. All of the units featured in this video took part in this game. See if you can spot them. The next showcase video will be looking at the mighty army of the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I think that one's going to be a good one.